All right, let's talk about something really interesting. Ever wonder how our world is actually governed? I mean, there's no single world government, but somehow there's order. A lot of that comes from powerful, unwritten rules that nations have followed for centuries. Today, we're going to uncover these invisible laws.
I mean, seriously, think about it for a second. We don't have a global parliament that passes laws for every single country. So where do these fundamental rules come from? The rules that say where a country's border ends in the ocean, or why you literally can't just arrest a foreign diplomat. This question gets right to the heart of how our global system works. Well, a massive piece of that puzzle is something called customary international law. These are basically the unwritten rules of the road. They don't come from a big treaty signing or a vote. Instead, they just emerge from the consistent actions and shared beliefs of nations over time. They're the very bedrock of international law. So, to really wrap our heads around this, here's what we'll cover. We're going to start with the simple two-part recipe for every single customary rule. Then we'll look at what countries actually do and the crucial difference between a simple habit and a real law. We'll even talk about what happens with rule breakers. And finally, we'll see why this ancient source of law is maybe more important today than ever.
Okay, first up, the two-part recipe. And it's just like baking, right? You can't make a cake with just flour or just sugar. You need both. It's the exact same thing here. You always need two core ingredients.
And here they are. First, you've got state practice. This is the physical stuff, the objective part, what countries actually do and say out loud. It's the action. But, and this is crucial, that's only half of it. You also need the second kind of mental ingredient, opinio juris. That's the belief that they're doing that action because the law requires it. So you've got the action plus the belief. That's the magic formula.
All right, so let's dig into that first ingredient a little deeper. State practice. What does it actually look like in the real world? Like, how many countries have to do something, and for how long before it starts to morph into a real rule? Well, to figure that out, there's no better way than to look at a classic case. Okay, picture this. It's 1969. You've got Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands all kind of staring at a map of the North Sea, which is full of oil, and they're arguing about who gets what. Now, Denmark and the Netherlands, they want to use this simple idea called the equidistance principle. Just draw a line smack dab in the middle. But Germany looks at its coastline, which is kind of caved in, and says, whoa, no way, that's totally unfair to us. And more importantly, they argued it wasn't a real binding rule of law anyway.
And you know what? The International Court of Justice, they actually agreed with Germany. And in their decision, they gave us this killer quote that set a really high bar. The court said that for any practice to become custom, it has to be extensive and virtually uniform. That's a big deal. It means it can't just be a few countries doing it every now and then. Nope, it's got to be widespread and it's got to be consistent.
So let's just break down what the court laid out. The big takeaways are the practice has to be widespread and representative. It's got to be consistent. And super important, it has to include the states that are specially affected by the rule. But here's the kicker, and this surprises a lot of people. It doesn't actually have to take a super long time. A rule can pop up pretty quickly if the practice is strong and consistent enough. Okay, so we've got the action down. Now for the tricky part. The second, more abstract ingredient, the belief. Opinio juris. This is the secret sauce, It's what transforms a simple habit, something countries just do, into a binding law, something they must do.
I mean, how do you even tell the difference? Countries do stuff all the time just to be polite or out of tradition. Think about naval ships saluting each other at sea. It's a common practice, right? But does any captain think they're breaking the law if they don't do it? Of course not. So where's that line between just being courteous and having a real legal duty?
A court wrestled with this exact problem way back in the famous SS Lotus case. The argument was basically, hey, countries almost never prosecute foreign sailors for accidents on the high seas, so there must be a rule against it. But the court's response was brilliant. They said, hold on a second. Just because countries don't do something, that doesn't automatically create a rule saying they can't. You have to prove they're holding back because they believe there's a legal duty to hold back.
And this brings us right back to our North Sea case. It's a perfect example. The court looked at the few countries using that middle line principle and basically said, yeah, they're doing it, but not because they think they have to. They were doing it for reasons of courtesy, convenience, or tradition, but there was no sense of legal duty. And without that belief, well, you've got nothing. No custom.
And this isn't some old, forgotten idea. It gets reinforced time and time again. Decades later, in the huge Nicaragua case, the court basically slammed the gavel on this point. It's not enough for states to act the same way.
They have to be doing it because they believe the law demands it. That belief, it's literally everything.
So we've got our two-part recipe, action plus belief. Seems simple enough, right? But of course, international law is never that simple. So what happens when a new rule is bubbling up, but one country is standing on the sidelines saying, nope, not for me? Let's talk about the rules for the rule breakers.
This leads us to this really cool idea called the persistent objector rule. The name kind of says it all. Basically, if a country clearly and consistently objects to a new rule while it's still being formed, then that rule won't apply to them, even after it becomes law for everybody else. They get to opt out. But, and it's a big but, there are strict conditions. You can't just wake up one day and decide you don't like a rule. First, you have to object early. You've got to raise your hand while the rule is still taking shape. And second, you have to object consistently. You can't be wishy-washy about it, objecting one year and then going along with it the next. It has to be a clear, constant no. The textbook example of this is the Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case. The UK was trying to say there was a standard 10-mile rule for how you draw boundaries across bays. But the court said that rule didn't apply to Norway. And why not? Because Norway had always opposed any attempt to apply it to the Norwegian coast. They were the perfect persistent objector. All right, another really important question. We said the practice has to be virtually uniform, but let's be real, the world isn't perfect. Does state practice have to be absolutely 100% perfect for a custom to form? What happens if a country breaks the rule? This is another place where the Nicaragua case gave us an amazing insight. The court said, no, perfect compliance isn't needed. What really matters is that, in general, countries act in line with the rule. And get this is the wild part. When a country breaks a rule, but then tries to justify its actions, maybe by calling it an exception, that can actually strengthen the rule. It's like, by trying to make an excuse, they're actually admitting that the rule they just broke is real.
Okay, so this all brings us to our final and maybe most important question. We live in a world that is jam-packed with written treaties and international conventions. So why do we still care about these unwritten, ancient rules? Do they still matter?
And the answer is a huge, resounding yes. They are absolutely essential. Think about it. Customary law fills in the gaps that treaties leave behind. It governs all the stuff that nobody's gotten around to writing a convention for yet. Crucially, it applies to states that haven't signed a treaty, making sure there's a basic set of rules for everybody. And, as we've seen, it can even exist right alongside a treaty, covering the same topic but as its own separate source of law.
A report from the International Law Commission, which is the UN body that studies this stuff, sums it up perfectly. It makes it clear that even with a world full of treaties, custom is the fundamental safety net underneath it all. It governs what isn't written down, and it applies to everyone. It's kind of like the default operating system for the entire planet.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. As we're facing all these new, fast-moving challenges, things like cyber warfare, AI, regulating outer space, areas where writing a treaty can take decades, could it be that these unwritten rules, the ones that can grow and adapt organically from what we do, are actually becoming more important than ever before? Something to think about.